Hello everyone, thanks for coming. There's still tea and coffee, so do feel free to go fill up your tea and coffee. And also I'm recording this so that we can upload it to our site later, hence the sound, and thank you, Matt, for the sound. And thanks everyone for coming. It's really great to see lots of faces interested in our common sense budget for Northern Ireland. So first of all, my job here really is to set the context of why we're doing this and why a couple of weeks ago over a cup of coffee, myself and Alex and Aoife came up with the idea of doing this in the first place. It was born out of frustration and born out of anger. We're facing yet another financial crisis here in Northern Ireland, in the midst of one already. We're now 18 months, or more than 18 months, without Assembly and Executive, and more than 12 months without ministers, although there were caretaker ministers until October of last year. In the midst of that, the Secretary of State imposed that punishing budget that has led to every single government department making cuts in services, effectively. And worse than that, the Secretary of State has now instructed each of those government departments to find ways to raise revenue. So that's to go above and beyond the cuts that have already been made and to find ways of bringing money in. And a few of those consultations have already happened. Things like concessionary fares, they want to raise the age at which you're eligible for a smart pass. But also some of them are still coming down the line, and we're expecting in the next few months consultations on water charges, for example, on raising third level student fees. And multiples of other consultations coming our way in ways that are trying to make money. And we're going to talk a bit more about that in a moment, but our thesis is basically this. This situation is unfair. We are being punished for our lack of government, which is not of our doing. It's undemocratic because we don't really have scrutiny over what's happening with the budgets, and it's totally financially unsustainable. And the proposals we're going to make shortly are designed around the idea that we're actually doing more harm to ourselves through these budgetary measures than we are good. The framing that you will hear from the Secretary of State when he stands in front of microphones in a lot fancier rooms than the one we're in now, although it's pretty fancy to be fair, this is first of all our own doing. We overspent last year, you got to make the money back. And the other framing is, it's not fair that Northern Ireland should have certain things when GB, I'm just going to call it that, to mean England and Wales and Scotland don't. So we're going to bust some myths around that too. Repeatedly, the Women's Policy Group, of which I'm lucky enough to be the chair, have written to the Secretary of State, and repeatedly he has told us in ever more terse framing that this is your own fault, and really there's nothing we can do, this is necessary. But it's not necessary at all. Our argument is that, very simply, spending money now will save money in the long run, and allowing things to get worse and fall into further disrepair will actually cost us far more money next year, 5 years, 10 years from now than it would to invest now. So I'm going to use an analogy that is the opposite really of the kind of arguments that the Secretary of State and indeed the Chancellor of the Exchequer make on a regular basis. Their argument is basically this: if you spend too much, you're going to have to cut your cloth the next month or the next week or the next year. If you get paid at the end of November and you're going into December, you know exactly what your budget is because it's your salary, and you just got to spend less than you get in, and it's as simple as that. But that's true for household budgets, but it's not true for the state. And we understand the argument of, well, you've spent too much, you just got to save more in our own personal lives. So I suppose the Secretary of State, the Chancellor, they expect us to apply that logic to the whole state. We know that's not true. We know that when it's necessary, money can be found. It's found for things like, furlough and Eat Out to Help Out and all those kind of things that happened around COVID. But it's also true for big, expensive projects, like especially large infrastructure projects, When they want to build a road, they don't put a couple of pounds in a month. They take a huge investment, they build a road, and then it makes its own money back over time. On the other hand, households aren't like that, and households and states just simply aren't the same kind of thing. I'm going to use an analogy throughout all of this that comes from, I mean, it's very famously used lots of places, but it's very famously used by the author Terry Pratchett in his book Men at Arms, and I've put the full quote into our budget document. And the argument is it's expensive to be poor. You spend more trying to save money than you do just investing. So the quote is this: the reason that the rich were so rich, Vimes reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. Take boots, for example. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that would be still keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while a poor man could only afford cheap boots, would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. So that's true for individuals, but the state knows this, and the state knows that spending the metaphorical $100 or $50 on boots now will save us spending $100 and still having wet feet in 10 years' time. So it's really important that we remember all of that. That's the underlying argument in all our budgetary proposals later. The other thing I want to stress is these arguments around the need to raise revenue, the need to make more money as what they like to call Northern Ireland PLC, a thing that doesn't exist. They argue that we have super parity. We have things here that they don't have in Great Britain. So the argument is basically Northern Ireland is better off than Britain in these certain ways. The examples are things like domestic water charges. We don't pay for them separately, although they are folded into our rates. Also, there's welfare mitigations that was brought in by our Assembly and paid for out of our block grant. It's not something gifted extra to us. University tuition fees are lower here. Again, that's something they've taken a hit for in the block grant. Concessionary transport fares. We do get the smart pass younger, and that's why they're trying to raise the age. But again, coming out of our block grant, and charges for domiciliary care, that's the care that you might get in your home after leaving hospital when you're physically well enough to leave hospital, but not physically well enough to be fully independent. And the argument is, well, Northern Ireland gets all these things without having to put in extra for it. Prescription charges is another one. Why is that fair? But what's never really mentioned is the ways in which Northern Ireland has sub-parity in comparison with Britain. And so these are the things that put us at a disadvantage. And they include things like childcare. We don't get the 30 hours free childcare that they get in Britain. That keeps people out of work. That means less money going into the economy. So that actually paying for childcare would be a revenue-raising measure in the long run. Mental health spending, at which we get far lower rate per person than they do in England and Wales, and considering our history, there's a greater need for it here. And public sector pay, which has been frozen for a very long time and puts us at a rate much lower than our compatriots across the border. And these are all policy choices. They don't have to be this way. There is no rule that says it has to be this way. Every budgetary choice is a policy choice. And every time that the Secretary of State writes us a cranky letter that says, it has to be this way, it is not true. Every choice that's ever been made in a room somewhere in Westminster before being announced at the dispatch box is a choice. Austerity was a choice, and so are all of these revenue-raising measures a choice. They put every single area of super parity on the chopping block, but they don't put any areas of sub-parity in as alternative offers. And that is both unfair and economically unsustainable. So what we're going to do in this exercise, and it is an exercise, we're picking out highlight budget proposals per department to try and spend to save. Spend to save is the core argument here, that if you spend the money up front, you will save it in the long run. And we all understand that. Taking back to the domestic analogy that we know it's not the same as, we all know that sticking a bit of duct tape on a leaking pipe might save you money this week, but the pipe's going to go. And it makes much more sense to spend on the pipe before it floods your bathroom or your kitchen. So I'm going to sit back down and I'm going to let Alex present our budget proposals.
Hello, I'm Alex Brennan. I'm the coordinator of the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group and a member of the Women's Policy Group, that the team that helped kind of put this together. So again, I'm going to go through basically some of the budget proposals that we've listed for each department within our document, but I really want to highlight that this is not an exhaustive list of every policy that we think departments need to be considering when they're preparing for the next budget, because if it really was, we'd be here multiple days. You know, there's so much that really the government can spend now to save on later. But we're just going to give about 1 or 2 examples per department. And we just really want to highlight again that departments need to meet with us and other experts to properly consult with us, because we can provide the expertise on what the impacts, whether they be positive or negative, are regarding inclusions or exclusions of things within the budget. So to start, we're going to go with the Department for the Economy. So we think it's common sense to maintain student fees at their current rate to ensure students have access to affordable higher education. So this is one of the more recent proposals to raise revenue from the Department for the Economy. It's extremely short-sighted, because in light of the department's efforts to support a stronger, more diverse workforce through their 10x economy plan and the skills strategy that were published in 2021, this is going to severely impact on their ability to move those strategies forward. In a 2019 study from Pivotal, they found that 88% of students that were completing higher education outside of Northern Ireland had no intention to return following graduation. And if fees are raised, there's a likelihood that students will choose to study either in the Republic of Ireland or elsewhere in the UK, because either, you know, where fees are cheaper here, there may be better opportunities in those places, or more diverse options outside of Northern Ireland, so it might influence students' decisions. And if they do leave, then again, that study highlights that 88% of students decide not to come back. So following the pattern highlighted by the Pivotal research, this will severely impact on the future workforce here in Northern Ireland. For the Department for Communities, we think it's common sense to ensure that organizations providing frontline services to vulnerable communities are adequately resourced to do so. I think this is something that's been raised quite frequently within the community voluntary sector, especially in light of a lot of the defunding of the community voluntary sector. But the work that these organizations do reduces incredible pressure on our current public services that are also being slashed within the current budget. They provide benefits advice, their food banks, their clothing banks, their mental health services, addiction services, childcare services. The list is really endless of what these organizations provide with the little funding that they are given with, even before the cuts. So, you know, to ensure that the pressure on public services doesn't increase significantly, you know, we believe that these services need an investment plan, not just little bits and pieces of funding. We also believe for the Department for Communities that it's common sense to ensure that those most vulnerable to the worst impacts of the cost of living crisis have access to help through schemes like discretionary support. So without the discretionary support scheme or other sort of schemes to help people that are faced with high levels of poverty, and this is a lot of time, particularly women, they'll be forced to turn to high-cost credit lenders and or illegal lenders. And in research that was done by one of our colleagues recently found that 6% of women utilizing high-cost credit lenders borrowed from legal lenders such as paramilitaries. So this only increases that activity when more people have to rely on lenders, illegal lenders, for support. And this will allow the loan sharks to trap people in endless cycles of debt and poverty, and will eventually maybe not cost the Department for Communities more money, but will probably cost the Department of Justice more money in their campaigns to tackle these sorts of illegal activities. For the Department of Education, we believe it's common sense to ensure that all children have equal access to quality education by prioritizing the end-to-end review of SEN in Northern Ireland, ensuring children with SEN can avail of specialized support and access to the same opportunities as children without SEN. So the SEND transformation program's budget was halved within their funding was halved within the 2023-24 budget. And that has created really, really deep inequalities, educational inequalities for children with SEN. And this will have a lasting impact on their educational performance, their confidence, their mental health. And again, this goes back to the Department for the Economy's trying to strengthen and promote a stronger workforce with better skills attainment. This is not going to help in that at all. And we are creating more barriers for these children as they grow up to the labour market. And future resources will be needed to mitigate this deep inequality that we're seeing amongst children with SEN. For the Department of Justice, we believe it's common sense to invest in the court systems so that the enormous backlog of cases can be cleared, prioritizing cases of violence against women and girls. So this is one of the key recommendations from the Gillen Review, and the investment in the court system is vital to moving cases along and to deliver meaningful justice for victims of all kinds of violence against women and girls. And this is also a reminder that we will go back to later on within this budget, but violence against women and girls costs Northern Ireland around £750 million per year. So this is just one tactic to help lower that cost to the government and to hopefully, either create or loosen up funding elsewhere that could be spent on something else. For the Department of Health, we believe it's common sense to sustainably resource our National Health Service so that it can meet the needs of people in Northern Ireland. And, for example, we want to highlight delivering and fully resourcing the rest of the 18 primary care multidisciplinary teams that were promised with a focus on rural communities. So it seems like it's common sense to invest in primary care so that people can access that care first before health issues worsen and they have to rely on hospitals and to continue putting pressure on hospitals. And since 2014, there's been a 9% decrease in active GPs, yet a 17% increase in the number of registered patients per practice. So it's clear that not only are hospitals under severe pressure, but our primary care units across Northern Ireland, but specifically access to those in rural communities is increasingly difficult. So to lessen the strain on hospitals, we really believe that prioritizing investment in primary care can help identify and address health issues earlier on to save money on waiting lists, on issues that will need further care past if they just see the primary care physician earlier on. For the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, we believe it is common sense to establish an independent environmental agency with responsibility for protecting our environment and preventing further ecological destruction. So while we currently have an environmental agency, it is not fully independent of government, and this, we believe, has caused for a lot of decisions to be made that would not be in light of promoting a stronger, more climate-focused environmental approach. And I think that we can see this in the flooding that's recently happened in the destruction of Lough Neagh. So we advocate to have an agency fully independent of government, an environmental agency that can hold them to account to meet these standards, as well as to ensure that environmental destruction cannot reoccur, because that will in the end cost more money to respond to rather than to prevent. For the Department of Infrastructure, we believe it is common sense to ensure that the body responsible for water and sewage services is adequately resourced to deliver safe, clean drinking water for the people of Northern Ireland and to respond to increasingly regular incidents of flooding. So at the minute, well, clean drinking water is, in our opinion, a basic human right, and the decision to stop treating water and sewage services would cost about £35 million. And I think it was recently said on review that those costs wouldn't even be fully realized within the first year of stopping those services. But £35 million, while it seems like a lot of money to us, again, like Elaine said, these aren't household budgets. That is a drop in the ocean of any funding of any government. It's such a small portion of the budget. So the proposals that would cease this treatment, it would see our wastewater treatment decrease from 99.23% compliant with wastewater treatment works to just about 25%. This is going to have an impact on health, on the environment. I mean, there's the fact of not having clean drinking water for an entire country is madness. And as well, the recent widespread flooding that we've seen in Northern Ireland has had a significant impact on families and businesses. Currently, about 5% of properties in Northern Ireland are at risk of flooding, and this is set to increase by 33% by 2080. So again, it's the forward thinking of, if we're spending money now, we can actually stop a lot of damage that will cost a lot in the future. For the Department of Finance, It is common sense to have a budget process that is transparent and accessible. So at the minute, our budget is incredibly, it's not open to the public, and it's incredibly difficult to understand, and even people that are working on it within government find it difficult to engage with. But we believe that increased citizen participation in the budget process leads to a strengthening of democratic processes and is a more effective use of public resources, because if there's better engagement with the people that are actually using the services, it's more likely that those services will be better targeted and, again, more efficient use of public spending. We also believe that the equality screening process should improve to ensure that equality impacts are properly anticipated and mitigated against. And again, this will lead to more targeted policy outcomes and better policy outcomes. And as well, for the Department of Finance, we believe it's common sense to keep parity with the rest of the UK when it comes to public sector pay increases. So in Northern Ireland, real pay for full-time public sector workers has fallen 7% this year alone, and this increases the disparity between public sector workers in Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And there are jobs that are crucial to public services and that, again, have kept our public services going even while they've taken year after year of funding cuts. Yet a lot of the workers within the public sector are forced to work multiple jobs and struggle to pay for essentials. So again, we're creating workforces that are becoming burnt out because they can't stay within these roles anymore because it's too much of a burden. So before we have an entire public sector that can no longer work within the public sector, we need to ensure that those jobs are not only viable, but that they support people to not have to work 3 to 4 jobs, to not have to use food banks, etc. And for the executive office, we believe it is common sense to resource and implement the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. As mentioned before, the TEO estimates that violence against women and girls costs Northern Ireland economy £750 million annually. And we know that Northern Ireland is one of the most dangerous places for women in Europe. It has one of the highest rates of femicide in Europe. So ultimately, resourcing this strategy would save the government money, as the need to respond to instances of gender-based violence would decrease and would prevent further revenue loss to the economy, such as through wages. So essentially, that is our recommendations for department. Again, it's a non-exhaustive list, and we could all sit here and be listing off one after another other things that the government could invest in now to save on later. But we would like to continue to go through our 3 recommendations, to say how we believe this could actually happen. So for one, our main sort of recommendation that could be advocated for at Westminster is implementing a funding floor for Northern Ireland. So a lot of the policy decisions that we've seen over the past years have been quick fix policy decisions, like Elaine's saying, putting a plaster on a leaking pipe. And this is the way that our budget and program for government has been made, and it's created the environment for crises like this to flourish. I mean, when you're looking at how many crises we're faced with now, between a budget crisis, cost of living crisis, physical health crisis, mental health crisis, crisis of violence against women and girls, democratic crisis, an environmental crisis. I mean, these decisions have implications, and we're seeing them accumulate at this moment. So in a 2010 report, in a 2010 Holcomb report, there was a needs-based funding floor that was proposed for Wales. And this was basically that it was revealed that there was an underfunding of public services in Wales. So if Wales was a region of England as opposed to a devolved nation, they found that they would have gotten more money for their public services than they were getting through the Barnett formula, which is basically the formula that determines the block grant that each of the devolved nations gets from the spending review, which is happening today at 12 p.m. So the funding floor for Wales was implemented in the financial year of 2018 to 2019 in order to prevent further gap in public service delivery and funding. And basically the funding from the block grant for Wales could not dip below this floor. So Northern Ireland is one of the lowest contributors to revenue per head in the UK, but it has the highest per capita spend at £118 identical expenditure on services per head. However, this spend used to be greater before the pandemic at £121 pounds per head, and Northern Ireland is the only nation to not have returned to or increased its pre-pandemic services per head spend, So in the 2019-2020 outturn, I believe there's a chart within the document. You could see that spend per head in England was £97, and in 2021-2022 outturn, it was £97 again. In Scotland, it was £116 per head. In 21-22, it was £117 per head. And in Wales, it was £110 per head in 2019-2020. And in 21-22, it was 113. In Northern Ireland, it was £121 per head in 2019-2020. In 21-22, it's 118. So we're the only part of the UK that has not returned to pre-pandemic identical expenditure on services per head in the UK. So the Holcomb report figure for this is a bit of a different kind of measurement of services per head. The identical expenditure services is a bit more accurate, but you can also measure it by the departmental expenditure limit, so DEL or DEL. Spend per head in Northern Ireland was £121 per head. So that's when they had done that report for Wales in 2010. They figured the number for Wales, but they also did it for the other 12 nations. So £121 per head was the number they had gotten for Northern Ireland. But the Fiscal Council for Northern Ireland recently kind of did a reanalysis of that number, and they included policing because that was not a devolved matter in Wales, but it is in Northern Ireland. And they determined that it was actually anywhere between £120 to £124 per head, more preferably £124. So this is a clear example, and it suggests that the current allotment does not meet our needs to determine needs as determined by the Holcomb report and by the Fiscal Council. So we are currently being underfunded. And there's this thing called the Barnett squeeze, which is basically that devolved nations have a higher spend per head than England, but the Barnett formula that we have that determines the money that we get from Westminster creates a convergence of spending across the 4 nations. So if all of the 4 nations have the same spend as England, it would be a smaller increase per head in the rest of the devolved nations, which would lead to underfunding of each of the devolved nations. So basically the Fiscal Council has predicted that this Barnett squeeze will be fully realised in Northern Ireland by 2030, but even the numbers of £118 per head in 21-22 suggests that we are already fully headed towards that squeeze of being underfunded. So the time to implement a funding floor in Northern Ireland is really now, because we're a low-wage economy with the highest rate of economic inactivity across the 4 nations. We have the highest uptake of universal credit and equivalent legacy benefits in the UK, and more people are cutting back on essentials here than anywhere else in the UK. And while spend may seem quite high, even if we have the highest amount of spending relative to England and the other devolved nations, it's because the need in Northern Ireland, warrants it. So again, the argument is we're spending the most on you, so you really shouldn't complain. But based off our needs, we are being underfunded, and we should demand the funding floor, because the Barnett formula was never meant to be permanent, and they just made an adjustment for Wales, and the infrastructure is already there in place to make that infrastructure and to make that adjustment for the other devolved nations. So we demand that a funding floor be put in place so that we can tackle underfunding of Northern Ireland at a Westminster level before it gets as bad as it did in Wales in terms of underfunding. Our other recommendation is the need for a programme for government, or in light of not having an executive, some programme for governance. For the past 2 financial years, departments in Northern Ireland have been making decisions without ministers, an executive, and a programme for government. And the last programme for government, the last official one was 2012, but 2016 there was a draft programme for government that at least provided departments and the public with a bit of a framework for some overall policy direction during a time with no government. We're back with no government, and we don't have any of that. We don't have any sort of guiding policy to determine, where departments should be spending, what are the long-term plans, cross-departmental. We obviously know departments have their own strategies and whatnot, but again, they a lot of the times work in silos. So we need that overall government approach. And without this, we've seen departmental overspends and a general lack of direction of resources. So budgeting without a guiding document like this is bad practice, and that is coming from the OECD, because budget needs to be informed by policy objectives and not the other way around. The programme for government also provides transparency for the public and allows for proper scrutiny, which we talked about was an issue for the Department of Finance. And these crucial aspects of good budgeting have been absent in our budgeting process, especially in the most recent budget set by the Secretary of State. And the only consultation that was given on this budget was regarding to the equality impact assessments and equality screenings, which really did not provide much scope for actually influencing policies as much as mitigating the worst of the impacts. So while a program for government may not be possible to sign off without an executive in place, a draft governance document to guide the direction of next financial year's spend with the input of public consultation is essential to follow good budgeting practices and to ensure that we don't continue down this road of overspend and little transparency. One of the other recommendations that we had is around good budgeting, and particularly gender budgeting. But I will bring Kelly Turtle up to talk a little bit more about that and her project as an Ulster University. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, so I'm a Research and Engagement Associate at Ulster University working on our gender budgeting project. It's a joint project with the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group. And I have to answer the question, what is good budgeting? And I'm going to do that through the lens of gender budgeting, speaking to key ask 3 in the report. So gender budgeting or gender responsive budgeting is a process-based mechanism that looks at how we can do more with the budget that we have. It aims at mainstreaming gender analysis right through the development of all public policy and resource allocation, and also revenue raising if we get around to that part as well. It's increasingly popular globally. It's supported by a number of international organisations, I suppose most prominently the OECD, who report that 61% of all of their member states now use some form of gender budgeting, and they've developed tools for measuring progress around all different countries. They also mentor countries into the gender budgeting process. For us in Northern Ireland, you will be unsurprised to hear that we are lagging behind the other developed nations around us, the Republic of Ireland, where there has been progress either in policy commitments or actual concrete measures put in place to implement gender budgeting. So just to say a little bit about what it actually is, and I'm looking out at faces in the room who know very well what it is, but just to get everyone on the same page, it's about looking at budgets through a gender lens. There are some myths around it. It's not about having a separate budget for women and a separate budget for men. And it also doesn't necessarily require an increase in resource allocation. You can do gender budgeting when your budget is increasing. You can do gender budgeting when it's decreasing. And in fact, that's the time when you probably need to be doing it the most, because you need to be aware of any differential impacts of a decreasing budget on women and men, but also all of the equality groups. So it starts with analysing the impact of public spending through a gender lens, and then it goes on to embed tools to actually address those differential impacts. It's not one particular thing. You can implement lots of different tools to do gender budgeting, and it's really tied to making sure that the state is meeting its equality aims through how it raises and spends money. It's all about challenging the status quo and challenging how things have always been done. It challenges assumptions about budgets, the most obvious one being that a budget is gender neutral. And we know in Northern Ireland we have a very big tendency towards gender neutral policy making and decision making. And so it challenges that by requiring people to actually look past that assumption, analyse the data, find out what those different impacts are. And so it has 3 stages. You have to do the gendered analysis of the impacts, you have to gather the data, and I'm going to give you an example in just a second of a piece of research that Ulster University undertook to do just that. But it doesn't stop there, and that is another issue we have in Northern Ireland when it comes to analysing not just budgets but policy more generally. We've had a lot of impact assessments recently, particularly around the budget allocations, that do point out where the problems are. They do point out the pre-existing inequalities, but that's where it stops. Gender budgeting requires much more proactive work than that. Stage 2 is about making decisions to address those, reformulating your budget decisions to address those inequalities. And then thirdly, embedding that, mainstreaming that through your entire budget process at every stage. So the example that I mentioned is a piece of research that Ulster University undertook, looking at one particular area of policy and spend, which is apprenticeships in Northern Ireland, the Securing Our Success strategy on apprenticeships. a strategy that on the surface looks completely gender neutral and actually has policy aims written into it that explicitly say we want to create equal opportunities for women and men, for girls and boys when it comes to apprenticeships. But when you analyse the impact of the spend, it completely undermines that policy aim. Because whenever Ulster University looked at the figures, they found a hugely disproportionate spend on men and boys. In fact, the GVA, the gross value added, was at a rate of 2 to 1 in favour of men and boys. So it doesn't just ignore gender inequality, this policy, it actually further embeds it and entrenches it because it supports that workplace and labour force segregation that then follows people throughout the entire course of their lives. So why is that gender disparity there? I have some lovely graphs for this, but I'll have to email them to everyone afterwards. Well, obviously the first thing, which people already knew before we did this research, is that men are overrepresented in apprenticeships generally, and that's increasing year on year. So from being 59% of all participants in 2013 to 2014, in 2019 to 2020, men made up 70% of all participants, and women's representation has actually has shrunk considerably. But it's more than that, it's about where men and women take up apprenticeships. It's that labour force segregation. Because in the more sort of higher value apprenticeships, which would be building and construction, engineering, all of those type of sectors, I mean, the figures for those are things like 99% men in building and construction, 98% in engineering. The other end, you've got apprenticeships in health and social care and services, where women are much more represented there, but there are far fewer of those types of apprenticeships, and they tend not to have the same level of investment. Particularly when you look at higher level apprenticeships, which are the kind of high resource ones, again, men dominate those. So if we didn't dig into those figures and understand the impact that that policy has, we'd be completely oblivious to this gender disparity. And I know that's just one policy area, but the argument that we're making is that that's a microcosm of what's happening across all of our policy areas, all of our budgets in Northern Ireland. There are those gender disparities everywhere. I think the women's sector in particular have always been looking at those and trying to draw attention to those. And that's the type of analysis that we need to start seeing from policymakers and decision makers. So we need gender budgeting in Northern Ireland to do better budgeting. There are persistent socioeconomic inequalities, obviously between women and men, but across all Section 75 groups. And gender budgeting, because you're applying that equality lens to budgets, it actually helps to then, it helps you to better identify the other inequalities, especially when we take an intersectional lens, which is extremely important now in all of our gender equality work. So we have these pre-existing inequalities, and without analysing the impacts, our budgets and our spending decisions are further embedding them. But it goes beyond that. It ties into and helps, I suppose, meet the requirements of better budgeting, as has been raised in recent audit reports, particularly the Public Accounts Committee's report of 2022, which highlights a number of recommendations that are extremely relevant to gender budgeting. So within the engagement section of that report, for example, it talks about the fact that budget documents are very technical, they need to be more transparent, more accessible. The committee recommended a training programme. There needs to be more done to raise the level of knowledge of budget terminology. The high level nature of budget allocations made it very difficult for stakeholders to actually look at what was being funded and to be able to challenge the decisions and the priorities, which is exactly what we're doing here today. And in particular, the committee was very concerned at the rushed nature of a lot of the budget allocations. A number of departments weren't even providing assembly committees with information on their bids. So gender budget, you can't do gender budgeting without addressing those priorities. Gender budgeting has to be accountable, so it makes your budget process much more open and democratic and performance-based. Because you're analysing those impacts, it's bringing you back constantly to having to account for the decisions that were made and whether or not they met the outcomes that you were trying to meet with through your policy agenda. It has to be transparent, So it has to be much more open to public scrutiny, and not just scrutiny, but involvement at the earliest possible stage. It has to be accessible, and it has to be evidence-based. And budgetary processes need to be participative. Civil society have to be really involved, and gender budgeting requires that, requires the participation of active and engaged civil society organisations, much like what we have represented here today. And finally, my favourite one, it requires budgets are transformational, because when you do this process and you do it properly, you will end up with different outcomes. You will not end up with the same patterns of spending that we've always had. I feel actually like I need to qualify that transformational one, given what we've been talking about this morning, because transformation, it could go either way. And I think, you know, sadly we're seeing budget processes at the minute that are transformational in the wrong direction. They're going to potentially, as we've heard from Elaine this morning, set society back. So we need to be addressing that. We need to be moving forward. So just to kind of back that up with what the OECD says, the OECD argues that gender budgeting results in better governance because it requires that greater transparency about the budgetary process and the decisions and how they were made and what the impacts are. It links policy and budgets together, which we often hear so much about how the siloed working. And I was chatting to a colleague this morning there about even within the university, you know, to promote this project or to develop this project, we've brought together social policy and finance professors to lead this project because we recognise the need for that really clear integrated approach, not just to understand the nuts and bolts of budgets, but what budgets actually do in the real world. It encourages evidence-based policy making, it requires civil society participation, and it results in the restructuring of expenditure. And it facilitates meaningful implementation of equality and human rights duties. And I think we have to never forget that one, because, you know, as we're talking about like all the nice benefits, saving money in the long run, you know, having better governance, at the end of the day, this is about rights, this is about equality and the duties that the state has. So I hope I've made the case for gender budgeting as a mechanism for achieving this. And just that sort of to summarise again, this is not about always asking for more money. We absolutely do need more investment, but there's so much that can be done to redistribute that money better. We've heard so much over the last decade or so about rebalancing the economy in Northern Ireland. This is a rebalancing, a financial rebalancing that is desperately needed. So I'll send you the slides and you can look up the research papers that Ulster University has produced online. Thank you.
Okay, folks, we have a bit of time now for questions, if there are any questions from the floor, and discussion, and I've set up 2 seats so that myself and Alex and Kelly can kind of take them. But I will say, if you are answering a question, come to the microphone. We're recording it for people who couldn't come, and they won't pick up the sound if you don't speak at the microphone. But the question can be asked, obviously, from the floor. No problem. So if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts, now is the time. Hi, Dan.
First of all, thank you to all of you, because it's very clear work has come into the county, you're doing well. And I'm persuaded, and it's given a sort of sense that those at the top will be persuaded as well. But what if those at the top really don't care? And just what you were saying, Kelly, the policies they're implementing are going to be transformational, but in the wrong direction. And I think what we saw with COVID is the government really don't care how many people die, particularly those people at the bottom, the old, the ill, the disabled, or just the poor, the attitudes to the poor and to women, obviously, particularly poor. So, what do you do when we've got these arguments? And it makes sense, we're not saying that if there's going to be any redistribution of carrying connection, we've got people at the top, the power, the ones that have the power, and where they want to redistribute, through saving Thatcherism on, has been upwards. So the rich are getting richer, and those at the bottom are getting poorer. The ones at the top really don't care. And we don't want to pursue policies. And if we actually look at what's happening now, with their neoliberal ideology and their privatisation policies, so that everything, misery, poverty, war, everything has to make profit for them at the top. So we're almost surplus to requirements. But I know what you're saying, I'm so angry. And I'm angry. And this is what's driven me to, look at all these things and make these very sensible arguments.
Who's listening? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much of the question was picked up by the audio there, but in essence, I think, Dan, you were asking, these arguments are persuasive, but the people who need to listen aren't listening. So how do you get them to listen? And I'll start before I pass to either Alex or Kelly, whoever wants to jump in. To me, this is a question of like political philosophy. It's about what you believe in. And we said all along, choices made back at the time of quote-unquote austerity back in 2010 were political choices. They didn't have to be made. Human beings looked at the various range of options and chose the ones that they knew would cause suffering to the most vulnerable, but would, in their view, serve ends they thought were more important. And that was, I suppose, dealing with debt. They talk a lot about paying down debt. And it seems to make intuitive sense to people. Go back to that household budget analogy. Well, okay, I might not get what I want for the next year, but I'm paying down my credit card debt or whatever, and then I can get back on an even keel. But state budgets are not like that in quite the same way. So there is a choice made about how you get out of a financial difficult hole, and your options and my options in our private lives are not the same as the state's options. And there's competing philosophies, and lots of people would say you have to spend to dig yourself out of it. You invest to save, just like I'm saying here. But that's not really the question. The question was, how do you get them to listen? And I would love to know. The problem being, if you are set in a certain way and it's a choice, somebody coming along and telling you it's a choice and that you could choose differently isn't going to persuade you to make that different choice. So it's a real dilemma of, who we vote for absolutely matters, but do we necessarily have the choices or the range of choices that we need to take us in a different direction? I'm not sure. But I'll pass over to somebody else, but you will have to come up here.
No, thank you for your question. I think, Elaine, I made really good points there. I just wanted to say, I think, you wish that they would do something on, say, violence against women and girls because they know that it's a bad thing. Do you know, women should be able to feel safe and not be harassed or abused, whatever. You think that they would ensure that there are places or ensure that there's funding for the SEN transformation program because educational inequality is bad. But I think the fact of the matter is the only thing that's going to get them to listen at all is if there's any sort of economic argument where they can either save on money or use money that was spent on something to spend somewhere else or anything like that. I think that's the only thing at the moment that is going to get through to them, is saying, well, if you actually spend money on this, you're going to save this amount of millions of pounds in the later run. Or if you spend right now on educational places for children with special educational needs, then this won't completely derail your 10-year, 20-year strategy that all of these other investors and private businesses have taken their money and time to spend on. And I think that that's something that is the only approach at the minute. You wish they do it because it's the right thing to do, but they're only going to do it if there's some sort of economic benefit to them, and if it can help with their relationships with maybe stakeholders that they deem, more important than civil society, essentially. I don't know how you want to.
This one is a highlight. There is a lot of political support for gender budgeting, and possibly that's because it doesn't in and of itself require more money. So there are all the political parties are supportive of it. There's been a motion passed in Derry and Strabane City Council, which Alex is kind of leading on then supporting the council to implement that, which would be really interesting to see if you can build that change from the ground up in the absence of the executive and everything. Once you start doing something, then other people can see that it can be done and that it works. So I think we have to take all those opportunities and be more grassroots about how we build towards change. But there is, I mean, for me, I think we have to be using all of the accountability mechanisms that exist just to protect against the absolute worst possible impacts. You know, and I'm mindful that in Ulster University, like my colleague in the law school, Ciara Fitzpatrick, is obviously one of the most prominent voices at the minute, calling for greater accountability with the impact of financial violence, I think she called it, didn't she? You know, so it has to come from that legal framework. It is ultimately a human rights and equality duty. It's probably the only ones we have left to hold them to. But that does make me mindful that this is a government that also wants to get rid of human rights protections. That's currently being framed in the populist language of anti-immigration, but you know, those are the same frameworks that we have access to protect against their economic policies. You know, it's very good they would have very good reason to want to get rid of them as they pursue an ever more conservative and repressive financial agenda. That's just me speaking personally, not on behalf of Ulster University.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any other questions or comments yet.
I think in terms of investment in the local community sector, this is evidence of work well spent, and thank you for it. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm involved in the Defend the Concessionary Francis campaign. You know, grey hair that takes great advantage of it. It's as treasured to me as my credit card. Just in relation to how it impacts on the economy, I mean, they might save money one way, but it's people like myself using the passes that keep the buses on the road. And the people don't think, well, government aren't thinking through the longer term. If we aren't using it because many people my age can't afford to pay for the buses, they're far too expensive. It will impact on the amount of buses on the road will be taken off. It will impact on drivers, how many, and there'll be redundancies. It will impact on all the other things you know about mental health and people looking after each other and be able to get to hospital appointments, etc., etc. But there's also the whole impact on the environment as well and the cost of that. But in relation to women, we did a campaign, went out onto the street and spoke to people, and women in particular are impacted on. Many of them will pay workers who are 60 and over depend on it to get to home work. And women we spoke to worked in the hospital as cleaners or low-paid jobs, or going to work in chippy. And the other impact is the mothers. Unfortunately, women are mainly the primary carers for children still, as are grandmothers. And they're dependent on friends who have loads of wee grandchildren, and they're dependent on getting to and from and taking the kids out for the day. But not only that, their children are dependent on them doing it because the cost of childcare they couldn't afford it. So, I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at it all wrapped up, what is the cost? What's the savings? It's a huge, it's going to be a huge amount of money that's going out of the economy, not into it. So I was thinking, just as you were talking, there was the cost of division, if you recall, and government tabled it buried it away somewhere in the archives, which looked at the impact of the conflict here on services. And I was thinking it would be worthwhile looking at the cost of austerity, and because I know we can put forward what you should and shouldn't do, but actually, unless it's put in economic terms and think you're right, they don't listen to go, well, that's not very well, blah blah. But if you say, right, we take it out, 5 million, it's going to cost you 50 in the longer run, I think we need to do that. And the thing about that is, because there isn't any research to prove this, you know, one way or the other, it's up to them to prove what's wrong. We say it will cost this, and there's enough information in the sector to be able to come up with a lot of statistics. And I think that's the only way. I think you're right, the Tory government and our own government don't particularly care. You know, one that couldn't give a totally damn about women or low-paid workers or unemployed, and the other are too interested, in border issues and bread and butter issues. So I think the only way to hit them is to say your cost must be mine.
Yeah, and I think that was something that on the View last week, which Kieran was on, as well as Lucy Wilson from Mary. Also, just for the recording, it was just a question on, or comment really, on how cutting something like concessionary fares may save 5 million, but it'll cost how much to all the other services that won't be used. And I think that was the thing, is that even these revenue raising mechanisms that they're proposing, these costs, it's not like, you raise the concessionary fares age, and let's say the cost was 70 million, that you're going to get 70 million in the next budget. It'll take years to raise that amount of money, and really at the cost of, like you're saying, maybe people not being able to perform childcare duties, which will result in others needing work, people not being able to even access town centres or city centres, and which will have an impact on local business. People not being able to access GP appointments, which may again lead to furthering health issues, going to hospital. I mean, like, it is really endless, the amount of things you could connect just seemingly one small policy decision to the amount of costs that it could potentially have on government later down the line. So I think that that's a really good point. And I think, like you were saying as well, like, we have the number on violence against women and girls, how much that costs the government, of not doing. And I think that that's something that we want to raise as well, is like, especially now we have a government of officials, and everyone, obviously there's a lot of legal implications for decisions made and whatnot. But while it may seem risk averse to not make a decision, it's also quite risky to, well, it may seem risky to implement a policy. It's also very risky to not implement a policy, to not, to just go along with the cuts that the Secretary of State said. I mean, what is our economy and our public services going to look like in 5-10 years down the line, and who will be held accountable for that? And I think that that's something as well that should be considered, that these policy cuts aren't risk-averse decisions. They're actually quite risky policy decisions that will have severe impacts, like you're saying. And just, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I want to come back first of all to that. You said there's no research. I'm from Hartlepool, North England. Go to Hartlepool, as we all know. And it's happened in, I don't know the whole of England, the north of England. And when I go to England, a broken Britain is no exaggeration. It's awful and they're prepared to do things, they just don't care. You said about this, everything you said has come to pass. When I went home earlier in the year for funerals, and I go home now, I thought, I wanted to go and see my auntie. I thought that one was the best. And the services, the bus stops there said no service anymore. There's whole areas, and then the bus, whereas buses would go like they do here to different places, it'll be one bus every hour, goes everywhere. So it takes you around, you couldn't use it to go to work, etc. It's great, and I don't have an idea how bad they really get. That's what, we're talking about the consequences, but those consequences are visible. They're there already in England. And this is my concern. The people who actually, there's no one to reason them to produce. This is what will happen. They know this is what will happen because they've already seen and done it in England. And Scotland and Wales, I imagine.
Just to come in on that, because I the rage I felt when that consultation came in, that one from Department for Infrastructure about concessionary fares, was partially because I grew up in the countryside, and I don't mean like in a town that's smaller than Belfast. I mean like in the countryside. The nearest shop is a mile away, and it's actually a prefab building cemented onto blocks. In those parts of the countryside, there's often no service at all, or there's one bus a day, but that'll take you where you need to go, but won't necessarily take you back. or the bus coming back leaves 20 minutes after the bus going there arrives there. So you try doing your messages and also getting to the GP at that time. It's not happening. And then during the summer, it's very much like you've described. Services disappear because they're based on when the schools are running. So the bus that you might be getting will also be a school bus. That kind of thing is motivated entirely by what services can we run that will make us money, that will generate money. But public transport has to be more than just a money generating exercise. As bad as sometimes it can be to lose your pass or when every single year the fares go up, at least if you're in a city or a large town, there are usually some kind of options. Out in the countryside, those options go, you are often stuck. Especially in rural Northern Ireland, which has such a large proportion of our population relative to other parts of GB, let's say, many more people living rurally, and in those households, a house with a man and a woman and whatever amount of children, very often there is one car and that is driven by the man. So that car may as well not exist. It goes out the driveway in the morning time and it comes back in the evening time. And like you've described, you're often relying on public transport to do things like get yourself to your part-time job or get yourself to your job, do any childcare or school pickups. Women are much more likely to do that trip chaining thing where they get on a bus and then get off a bus to pick up the grandchildren. Then they get back on the bus and then they drop the first child and then back on the bus to drop a second child in a different school and then back on the bus again to get themselves to work. So they've been on effectively several different trips in one day. Think about how much that would cost in the absence of a pass. And we know this. And the reality is that the governments know this too, but like we said, philosophical decisions have been made about what the transport service is supposed to do, and that is make money. But really it's a public service, and it makes more money by getting people to work, by getting people, keeping people in work, and a million other things. And it's that argument of like, we know exactly what will happen, because we've seen those rural areas wither and die. We've seen those areas of the north of England, for example, but also there's plenty of rural areas in parts of rural Northern Ireland where people cannot get back into work, or because they can't physically get to work, or they cannot get their child to childcare because they can't physically get there. And so they've effectively retreated entirely within the home. And we know that within those environments, things like mental health issues, physical health issues, domestic abuse thrive because you're isolated, and isolation is at the root of all of it. That's the whole reason we have the pass in the first place, is to end that isolation. Whether you're using it to go meet your friends for a cup of tea, or whether you're using it to get to work, it's a pass to something better. And yes, it saves money, but I do think we need to make that money argument, because it's the only argument that's going to persuade anyone at all. Kelly, do you want to? No. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We've got time for one or two more questions, but we might take them both together and then we can do the circulation here before we close up.
Just a comment from me again. Andrea Brown from Disability Action. I suppose 100% agree with the gender budgeting model in terms of the equality lens that you're looking down. So absolutely really appreciate the fact the work that's being done there. And that you are looking intersectionally around, how disabled women are affected, all that kind of stuff. So 100% supportive of that, and I think that there's an opportunity. So yesterday I was at a round table with Julie Harrison, PermSec, and she actually sits in quite a unique position in that she's been a PermSec in our executive arm. Now she's the NIO, so she brings it's the first time I met her in that, because I met her through DFI. That's a whole different story. But and she the last comment yesterday at the round table, and obviously chatting House Rules, and she did say some stuff. One of the last comments was that if only if civic society could come together and produce an alternative budget. So I think there's opportunities there to and I just did mention to one of the girls from the NU that I was coming to this today, and I'll take that back, because I just think that, they're willing. The PermSecs are at a point now where administration for them as well is that they've done all they are legally allowed to do, but they do need, I think it needs refreshed, and we need to get in there. And I know we can't do anything without the politicians in place, but I think we can plant seeds at this stage around, you know, where that needs to go.
Totally agree. I'll pass over to the people, but the one thing I'll say is it would be so lovely to have some of the permanent secretaries here listening. But
I was just going to ask a quick question to group in with it. What can we expect to see today from the autumn statement? What are we anticipating?
I'll have my go at what can we expect from the autumn statement today, only on the basis that I don't think they even had a full draft of what they're going to say like yesterday lunchtime. I think they're listening and trying to figure out, right, backstep, right? There's an election coming. We don't know when it's going to be. I don't know if they do, but they know better than us. It could be next summer, it could be next autumn, it could be early 2025, but there's one coming. There's no way around that. And so at this stage in government's lives, they often start to get a little bit cold sweat. They're going to make a decision on us. It's not looking great if you look at the polls. And so they start to drop little breadcrumbs. Those breadcrumbs won't necessarily be the kind that we desperately need. There'll be a slight uprating on benefits, is my guess, but so slight as to be negligible and way below what it needs to be, but enough for people to feel they can breathe a bit easier. There will be some slight cut on national insurance, I expect, so that people who are in work are paying slightly less in national insurance, so you get more in your pay packet. Your salary hasn't gone up. Your salaries could be still way below where it should be, but you've got slightly more in your pocket. So it's enough for people to feel slightly less angry. That's what they're hoping for. But I don't think there'll be anything you can hang your hat on, just things that make people feel slightly less stressed than they did this morning. And that's really the best we're going to get from this current government. I'm sorry, I am actually speaking on behalf of my organisation when I say that's the best we're going to get. And even that, we cannot be grateful for pennies, for crumbs from the table. We have to keep asking for more. But that's my guess, and I'll hand over to anyone.
I'll just comment on your really good point about, you know, an alternative, and I think, I mean, probably one of the difficulties is if you looked at all the EQIA consultation responses from that last round of decisions, so, you know, all the organisations were all in there, all kind of fighting their corner for what needs more funding. So there's probably a piece of work to be done in like a sector that can come together around a shared set of principles and a shared methodology. I think it needs to be really evidence-based, and I think your point, Diane, about looking at England and being able to actually capture, just as you said, sort of how low they will go, and to be able to model what might happen here if we continue on the trajectory that we're on. So we need research, we need the likes of Nevin, you know, and all those kind of economic researchers to come on board. I'm really mindful of some of the stuff we raised in the presentation about the Public Accounts Committee and those issues around how inaccessible and how difficult it is to even understand budgets. And I think that as civil society, we are very comfortable in the policy space, and we know that, we know the parameters within which everything works, and we know how far we can push things. When it comes to economic stuff, we're having to learn a new language in a lot of ways. And for our training course that we've been developing, Aoife wrote a brilliant module called Demystifying the Northern Ireland Budget, and I mean it does a great job of it, but it's still you still feel a little bit mystified at the end. There's just so much technicality to get your head around. I think that is used often to keep us at arm's length as a sector, because there is a kind of, well, you don't really understand how complicated it is. So yeah, there's lots of factors that need to go into making that work, but absolutely we should be presenting an alternative. And the last thing I'll say is, like, this redistributive aim around it, more, you know, gender budgeting and kind of equality budgeting more generally, does require, like, there has to be some money taken from somewhere, and I think that's where, as a sector, we need to really set down what our priorities are. I think the kind of places that we would be advocating the money needs to come away from would be probably the types of sectors that the government are not particularly minded to take money away from, but that's, I suppose, where we can use our collective voice to advocate for that.
it's like musical chairs here. But also just to add on as well, like, I know you've brought up the spending reviews on today. I think it should be announced at around 12 p.m. And now is the time for us to really be making a lot of noise, because I feel like normally it's whenever the budget or draft budget proposals are published that we then have an idea of what is in store for us. But based off our last budget, we know that it's not going to be anything positive. And I think something that was said a couple of weeks ago at the Equality Commission and NICFA event is that anything that's non-statutory is on the line. So what would be great if people could, leave this event today and just really make a lot of noise today around Elaine's point, spend to save, and that, we are, like you were saying, at a cliff edge, essentially, of public service decimation. So we need to start making the noise now as departments, once they receive their block grant, start to put together, what their departmental budget will look like. Now is the time to engage with them, and I know a lot of those conversations have happened over the summer and the autumn time, but there's still time to engage before there is any sort of draft document and draft budget published. So that would be amazing if we could all just, that's something I think that civil society-wide we can put that pressure on, even if there's different aims that we're all bringing up, is the same sort of general message of don't, spend to save. And I think at a Westminster level, the funding floor, while it's not an end-all be-all fix-all, it's some sort of mechanism in place to ensure that even while our departments here are making really essential cuts to services and whatnot, that at least from Westminster, we're getting what we should be getting, and that there's no underfunding happening from them. It's just the policy decisions that are happening in Northern Ireland, which we have a bit more control over. But yeah, I don't know if there's any other comments. I'm happy to bring up Aoife now for some closing comments.
Spend, save, is there any narrative where they actually do spend enormous amounts of passports and military? We're giving it to every war that exists. We are supporting. Is there any merit there in highlighting just how much money we spend on things that make a lot for certain sectors, whereas other people are going?
Absolutely. I think that was something that we all talked about, myself, Elaine and Aoife, when we kind of came up with the idea for this. Of if only we thought about this about 7 or 8 months ago and had a team of economists with us to help, put together, like, either analyze that sort of spend or put together actually an alternative budget. And that's maybe something to think of for next year. So in the meantime, we just have, a handful of recommendations of what we think, in coming up to the next budget, or the start of the next financial year in April. But I think absolutely, and I think that there are some of those sort of conversations are happening in sort of research institutions like the Nevin Economic Research Institute or ESRI as well. And I think that those are the organizations, that have historically supported civil society initiatives to really, start strengthening the ties between ourselves and them to be able to actually make those arguments that are backed up by, institutional research. But yeah, absolutely.
Hello everyone, my name is Aoife Fallon. I work at the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and I'm part of the policy group on the Where's Our Democracy campaign. So I'm just basically going to do a bit of a sum up, but I just want to start with some thank yous first. Firstly, thank you to all of you for coming. It's really great for you to be here, and we're really glad that you took the time out of your day to come here. And I know that today's been really heavy, and in a lot of similar events that we've been at recently about budget cuts and the cost of living crisis, I've often walked away from them feeling really low about it and feeling a bit hopeless, but we don't want you to leave today feeling like there's nothing that can be done. There is things that can be done, and ultimately it's people like yourself turning up to events and getting involved in campaigns that is really going to change things. So hopefully you'll leave today not feeling hopeless, but feeling like this is something that we can raise our voices about and we can demand better for, because people here deserve better. So thank you to you all. Thank you to the Dunkern for having us, and thank you to Matt, who volunteered on sound at the back. some big thank yous for the Women's Policy Group, because the Wires of Democracy campaign is led by the Women's Policy Group, and several people contributed. The three of us here, Alex and Elaine and myself, but also members such as Siobhan Harding fed in, and people from outside of the policy group fed in, including Aidan Campbell, Nora Duncan, Aidan Campbell's from RCN, Nora Duncan from USI, Lisa Wilson from NERI fed in, and Liz Law on the Programme for Government bits as well. So there's lots of people that made today happen. So thank you to everyone for that. And thank you to Kelly as well, who came and spoke today. It was fantastic. And I just want to say while I'm here, like how proud I am to get to be part of this work and to work with so many inspiring people who really care about making a difference. And also to pick up on something that was said earlier about, you know, what happens if they just don't care? You know, what if they just don't listen to the arguments? And I don't know about Alex and Elaine, but for myself, I found it really hard to put together a document that was very much about making economic arguments for doing the right thing, because, you know, we're all passionate about equality, human rights, and that's our background. And, you know, to make the economic argument feels uncomfortable because it is the right thing to do. It's what people's human rights are. But, you know, the comment about what if they don't care, unfortunately, economic arguments are probably the ones that are the most likely to make them care. And that's why we put together a document that's very largely focused on economics and economic arguments, but ultimately it's also the right thing to do. So yeah, I'm just going to offer some closing remarks just based on today, and they're very brief, but yeah, thank you again for being here. So the purpose of today's event and the common sense budget that we have produced and we've launched here today was to convey one simple message. Cutting government spending during a financial crisis will not save the government money. It will cost the government more in the long term. Asking Northern Ireland to generate additional revenue at a time when our public services are on their knees will not lead to economic prosperity. It will simply plunge the most vulnerable in our communities deeper into poverty. Savings to the public purse should not be made on the backs of people in Northern Ireland who are already struggling to make ends meet. Supporting people in Northern Ireland through the cost of living crisis is not only the right and humane thing to do, it makes financial common sense. Without community and voluntary organisations, many of whom have lost government funding in this most recent budget cycle, demand will increase on food banks, benefits, mental health services, addiction services. Without funding for primary care, health issues will go unseen and untreated for longer, which will eventually put additional strain on hospitals. And as Elaine mentioned, we've written to the Secretary of State several times, and we've been told by him several times that nothing can be done about the cuts until the government is returned to Stormont. We've been told that without an executive, there's nothing the Secretary of State can do to support people through the cost of living crisis. Community organisations like the ones that are represented here today do not have the power to force parties back into government. And yet it is these organisations and the communities that they serve that are being punished as a result of the ongoing power vacuum. Northern Ireland is experiencing both a cost of living crisis and a crisis of democracy at a time when having a government to lead us has never been more important. We're calling on the Secretary of State to apply financial common sense in Northern Ireland and reconsider the cuts and propose revenue-raising measures. We're also calling on all political parties to do everything in their power to get back to government and start delivering for people who are really struggling with the cost of living crisis. And we will be continuing to work through the Wires of Democracy campaign, and we'd really love you all to stay involved and stay up to date, and if that's something that you'd like to do speak to us, because we're more powerful in numbers, and it's events like today that really bring us together and sort of solidify those shared aims. So thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone who was speaking, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.